So before I get started, I just want to say a special thank you to everyone who helped to organize this event, and especially for allowing me to reschedule when I was extremely unwell over the winter in December. And also just to say that this is a revised and expanded talk, which I gave previously at the Child in the Book conference in Malta, and I'm very much looking forward to your feedback on it. So with that said, I'll begin with Tangled Voices, Hidden Lives, Methodological Possibilities in the Children's Archive. In a letter to her editor, author and illustrator Espira Slobokina, most famous for her picture book Caps for Sale, writes about fleeing Russia with her family to northern China before eventually immigrating to the United States in her early 20s. She begins, "When we left Russia, we landed in the far eastern Russian part of Vladivostok. At that time, the Russian ruble was still worth quite a bit, so we came there well-dressed, well-heeled, and well-connected. However, the city was terribly overcrowded with similarly well-off refugees, and so we soon landed in a suburban villa in Manchuria." She explains in the same letter how her forced migration shaped her girlhood and her notion of citizenship and belonging. Describing herself as a love-struck girl, hanging on the heels of a young Chinese man who worked in their kitchen, Slobokina adds, "Seeing our determination to hang around his kitchen, he threw us occasionally a bit of information, a snatch of a song, a part of a story, or corrected our pronunciation of a Chinese word." Slobokina uses these childhood memories to defend the authenticity of the folktales she retells in The Flame, the Breeze, and the Shadow. Yet her story of migration, compelled by the rise of the Russian Civil War in 1917, meant that this experience left a deep impact on her, evidenced by her return to this same part of her life story in multiple letters in her archive. In contrast to Slobokina's exchange with her editor, a 1975 letter written by a group of children from a school in Indiana provides details about their Vietnamese classmate, a child named Phuc, who formed part of the first major wave of Vietnamese refugees following the fall of Saigon in 1975. The children urge author Ezra Jack Keats, best known for The Snowy Day, to write a book featuring this boy. Phuc, they write, comes from Vietnam and could not speak English at first either, like Juanito in My Dog is Lost. Suggesting ways for Keats to tell Phuc's story, they add, "Maybe you could call it Happy Phuc. You could tell about the first snow that Phuc saw." As the children relate Phuc's first encounter with snow, a story that takes a mere 4 sentences to finish, they describe Phuc's joy at seeing snow, his delight in tasting it, and in sharing it with his classmates. Stripped of Phuc's voice, however, it becomes difficult to discern if these details are more reflective of the joy of Phuc's peers. Unlike Slobokina, we know little about Phuc and what his experience of immigration was like, much less how much he felt he fit in with his predominantly white classmates. Yet what the comparison of these traces of childhood indicate is the value of developing interdisciplinary methods for reading and recovering the archived voices of children as a way of mapping transnational experiences of childhood. Framing these experiences within the context of war and the forced migration that often results from it, I will discuss what I call the children's archive, or the original material produced by children that has made its way into special collections. In considering the ways in which children's voices emerge through the archived materials left behind by them, letters, exercise books, artwork, and other scraps of memorabilia, I argue for the importance of bridging archival theory in the humanities with participatory research in the social sciences as a way of ethically engaging with these voices. The notion that the archive has the potential to disrupt or unsettle adult conceptions of childhood is certainly not new, nor is the fact that the very voices most impacted by these narratives are the ones most difficult to find. As Karen Sanchez-Epler relates in her influential essay in the Archives of Childhood, the researchers' desire to trace and pin down documents that evidence the lived experience of historical children is often one that goes unfulfilled. She gives the example of Carolyn Steedman, most well known for her study of the child acrobat Mignon in Strange Dislocations, who details in a separate essay her long search to discover a document, even a scrap, that might prove the existence of Henry Mayhew's Little Watercress Girl. My own romance is that I may find this child, that there is enough evidence in her narrative, that there is enough detail of her life and the life of her household to trace her. Steedman's search for the Little Watercress Girl is thwarted by a lack of sufficient evidence, but this does not stop her from attempting to create a narrative that imagines what her life may have been like. In one of her earlier accounts of this young girl's encounter with Mayhew, Steedman relates how, "It was here and during this month that we may assume he met the Little Watercress Girl, though it is possible that the interview took place a month or so later, in January 1851. Drawing on newspaper articles and other materials left behind by Mayhew, Steedman begins to weave an intricate narrative of missed encounters with the Little Watercress Girl, moments where she knows she likely appeared, but where she is never speaking. As Steedman's account indicates, the archive does not always offer up the material that researchers are most desperate to find, failing to provide empirical evidence that tracks and traces the lives of children. Even when these materials are available, there remain questions about how to read or interpret the childhood experience documented in them, and to what extent we might trust the voices of the children who authored them. Sanchez-Epler, along with other key scholars in childhood studies, have sought to attend to this concern, drawing on decades of debate within the field about adult and child power relations, beginning with that most famous of lines by Jacqueline Rose that children's fiction is impossible. Yet what I found fascinating in my own foray into interdisciplinary work is the fact that these very same conversations appear again and again among researchers within the social sciences, as they try to document and chart childhood experience in a different manner that attempts to both quantify and qualify what it means to be a child. In one report from children's geographer Matej Blazek, he describes the challenges of completing a participatory research project in a small deprived neighborhood in Slovakia, where he met two boys, Martin, aged 9, and Peter, aged 11, while acting as a youth worker on the streets. In reflecting on his interactions with the younger of the two boys, Blazek writes, "I found it difficult to integrate this story about Martin's brother, Peter, into my overall interpretive framework. Most troubling to the analysis was that I had no direct evidence from Martin. He never explicitly expressed to me his feelings over Peter or his new friends to me." Blazek, who is describing his conversations with Martin following Peter's removal to a juvenile detention center, notes how Martin frequently provides vivid details about his brother that he could not possibly know, due to lack of contact with Peter as confirmed by family members and other adults within the community. In his consideration of these narrative accounts, Blazek argues for a broader interpretation of children's voices, which involves examining the words of children while also framing these words within a broader interpretive framework that considers the child's actions and other forms of embodied experience. What Blazek's account reveals is that working with children in an effort to discover their voice is always a process of negotiation. This becomes particularly imperative when considering transnational experiences of childhood, especially in the case of those impacted by war and forced to flee their homes, as both Slobokina and Fouque were. While much of my work has focused on children as global citizens, I choose today to adopt the term transnational child, precisely because these were children who were shaped by movement beyond the nation, not as part of an educational initiative or national effort to foster global community and the world peace that was supposed to come along with it, but rather as a means for survival to escape persecution or the violence of war. If the global child secures a utopian vision of world peace, the transnational child puts this vision at risk, threatening to undo the borders and boundaries that are essential for propping up this vision. If we return to the archive, turning to a different letter by Slobokina that is dated much earlier than her exchange with her editor, we can see some of these ideas at work. Sobokina, who had very strong opinions about what children were capable of when it comes to reading, relates what she calls the story of my life at the request of one of her young fans, a girl named Mary. Sobokina confesses to Mary, "It would take much too long a time to tell you all about what happened to my family in those years. I'll only tell you that things did not go so well for us many a time, and that was a time when we were neither well clad, nor well fed, or well housed." Well, Slobokina begins her letter to Mary by relating her family's comfortable exit from Russia, enabled by their wealth at the time. She also cites how this comfort led both children and adults to ignore the dangers involved in fleeing the war, adding that they had a wonderful time of it and that we were never what is called refugees. This letter is curious for a few reasons. First, Mary, as the initiator of this exchange, is very nearly erased. Slobokina opens the letter by saying, "I hope this letter reaches the right girl because I could not read your last name too well. You know, it got rubbed off a little by the time it got into my hands." Second, it is one that reveals more about Slobokina's own childhood experience than the more formal exchange with her editor, Lillian. In that same letter, if you recall, Slobokina did not mention any challenges or difficulties associated with her migration to China, instead presenting an idealized childhood of mischief, fun, and play. While the voice that changes register here is in fact that of the adult author, Mary finds her way into the archive again in a response to a request, this time by Young Wings magazine editor Ruth Hoyer, for a biographical sketch. Dated January 24th, 1955, not even a year after her response to Mary, Slobokina rejects the offer to retell the story of her life, the same one she had told so easily to her young fan. She adds, "I hope you will forgive me for sending you instead this copy of a letter I once have written for a real little girl who wrote me a very nice fan letter. I hope it sounds more natural than if I tried to do an article for some abstract children. Of course, if it is too long or does not suit the purpose, you may change it in any way you like." The letter, which was published in the June 1955 issue of Young Wings in revised form with Slobokina listed as author, is where Mary disappears yet again. Details about Slobokina's arrival to China following the crash of the Russian ruble are rearranged to provide a simple account of her daily life, like where she attended school or private art classes. The stark difference between these two versions, the public one for the abstract child and the private one for the real child, draw attention to the dangers of trusting even the adult voice. Just as in the case study with Martin, the young boy who created imagined narratives about his older brother Peter, we cannot read a single account of Slobokina's experience of migration as a child, for even a cursory look at the letters and published materials that relate this period of her life underscores that the details were constantly changing, even if the main events remained the same. Indeed, it is ironically the child, a fan who she hardly knew beyond the single letter they exchanged, who draws out the personal detail of hardships, which she frequently withheld from adults in her professional relationships. So far, I have undertaken a fairly straightforward textual analysis of these materials, informed as they are by childhood studies scholarship. But what happens when the methodologies found in the social sciences, and especially those associated with participatory research with children, reorient our position in relation to these texts? For this example, we need to leave Mary behind and return to Phuc, the little Vietnamese boy who is the subject of a letter to Ezra Jack Keats. In the few archival items relating to Phuc, we know only that his classmates perceived him as happy. Indeed, their suggested story title, Happy Phuc, is a reflection of their views. Upon examination of the class photo that accompanies this oversized letter, Phuc's image seems to secure this vision of the story. At the center of the class photo, Phuc does indeed seem happy, a huge smile on his face. Yet if we pick up on the few details we are given, such as the fact that upon his arrival, Fuchs knew little English, a different story begins to emerge. In a 1976 newspaper article from the Evansville Courier, Fuchs appears again. Fuchs Pham, a first grader, is reading up a storm just through working in reading groups in his own class and having daily lessons with the remedial reading teacher. The article adds other important details, such as the fact that there are a total of 43 Vietnamese students in Evansville, but more children are expected, and that these students are dispersed in the school system, with 18 being the largest group of children at any one school. Moreover, the attitudes of the teachers vary quite widely, with one commenting that they are glad the bilingual tutors previously employed are gone because their presence causes the children to rely too much on Vietnamese. This report, coupled with other accounts of refugee children in similar situations, suggests that while Fuchs may have been a diligent reader, he may not have necessarily been happy. Now, some of you may be thinking, but these aren't children's voices. And you're right. They are not, by strict definition, all documents featuring children's voices, if by voice we mean a text produced and authored by a child. Yet the Children's Archive always raises suspicion about who is speaking, and just as in participatory research in the social sciences, I'm not convinced that is reason enough to stop listening. Those in children's literature will be familiar with the turn back to the child, initiated in large part by a wave of scholarship known either as childhood or children's studies, and recognized by such influential essays as Mara Gubar's Risky Business, talking about children in children's literature criticism. Bearing these arguments in mind, when I look at materials like that of Mary or Fuchs, I'm also thinking about how biases about what counts as an authentic voice can actually lead to the silencing of others, or devoicing as those within children's geography call it. Because I have the advantage of a rather broad range of children's materials, I was able to begin to see the patterns that emerged in how these children spoke or used their voices. Many of them, for instance, would ask an author for their photograph. There were also materials that seemed to put the child's voice at risk due to adult interference, such as one where a caregiver writes a letter on behalf of a young boy. Similarly, a set of letters from school children demonstrate the extent to which copying was involved in the production of the child's voice, though, as in this particular case, the teacher flags the original content to distinguish it from this copied material. There are also other items, drawings or paintings, which do not have any words to interpret, but still constitute as a reflection of that child and their experience. Do these materials count as part of the voice that we should be listening to as scholars? I would argue that they do. If we return to Fuchs once again, we can see why interpreting the mediated voices of children is imperative. Like Mary, Fuchs nearly disappears from the archival record, in part because the name of the school, Tompkins, is recorded, including in the printed class photograph, as Tompkins without an H. In addition, Fuchs' surname, recorded in the article I began with as Pham, Phom, was in fact the common Vietnamese surname Pham, Pham. When making this correction, two additional results from 1975 to 76 turn up in the local paper for Evansville. In one, Fuchs is described as looking forward to his first Thanksgiving. Listening to the stories of the hardships of the Pilgrims, Fuchs is described as being thankful for the opportunities he has in the United States, along with his parents who immigrated with him and the thousands of Vietnamese refugees who are now spending their first year in a new land. While the author of this small report dwells on how Americans should be thankful for their freedom, reinforcing national values, what makes this brief report so valuable is the one line that tells Fuchs' story. As the author relates, Fuchs, moved by the story of the Pilgrims, raises his hand and says, "Me a pilgrim, me come here for freedom too." The line, edited slightly for the title, clearly serves to uphold national values that reflect back an image of an exceptional nation that are central to narratives of U.S. empire. Yet they still give us a small window into Fuchs' life through his words, finally allowing him to speak instead of being spoken about by others. While in his speaking there are power relations that frame and limit our ability to interpret these words, they begin to unsettle adult assumptions about foreign refugee children flooding into small American towns like Evansville. Fuchs, in his refusal to see himself as different from the Pilgrims and by relation other Americans, suggests that he too belongs, and not just because he is a voracious reader or is beginning to grasp the English language. As he challenges the binary of domestic and foreign that the local newspaper presents, Fuchs seems to be urgently and insistently asking, "Can you hear my voice?" If we draw on some of the historical methods Steedman employs to trace the life of the little watercress girl, we can begin to get a fuller answer. Yet, as I will soon reveal, to trace Fuchs and other voices like his requires a careful and slow development of the relationships required in participatory research practices. For this particular case, I merged traditional participatory approaches, where researchers engage and work alongside children or other members of a community, alongside similar practices within the archive. These practices involve prioritizing the voices of those with a right to the record, working alongside them to consider how to organize, frame, and narrate these materials, including decisions about what not to include in the record. Rooted in social justice movements, those who uphold a participatory archival practice acknowledge the rights of multiple parties to the record. In the case of the Ezra Jack Keats item, this involves multiple participants, from the teacher who is writing the letter, to the children who are drafting it orally, to Fuchs himself, whose life is the subject matter of the letter. While I've not been able to track down all of these participants down at this point, I want to model what such an approach might entail and how it begins to shift the conclusions we might draw about the material in the children's archive. To do so, then, we must begin with Evansville as a site where the letter is drafted and created, going back to the mid-1970s when Fuchs and children like him were just beginning to settle in the area after fleeing Vietnam. In newspaper reports from the Evansville Courier, a similar narrative of the model minority is created, focusing on the speed at which young Vietnamese refugees managed to adapt and integrate into the school system and local community. In one report about siblings An and Bin Tran, for example, the children are described as quiet and mild-mannered, with the teacher claiming that her class of first graders has had this good behavior rub off on them. The report describes how the Tran siblings, who were 13 and 14 at the time, swiftly and repeatedly fold origami and induct the younger school children into the intricacies of this Japanese art. Bin and An, the reporter underscores, speak little English, and as they teach, they speak practically not at all. The reporter contrasts this silence with that of the younger children, who quietly watch in amazement as the little origami figures come to life, and in doing so begins to transform the reason for Bin and An's silence as well. Not necessarily failing to speak due to lack of knowledge of the English language, they are instead presented as experts quietly concentrating on their work. The little paper figures are described as intricate art, which is made with a few expert folds and tears. In closing, though, the reporter makes a familiar turn to reframe the children as well-integrated Americans, noting how they have Americanized their names and adopted the Western practice of putting their surname last. The report on the Trans reveals that Fuchs' own story of immigration is not unique. Indeed, many like it could be found in newspapers across the United States at the time, focusing specifically on Vietnamese refugees as the model minority. Yet what I find interesting about the reports specific to Evansville is how the variation in that experience is depicted. Unlike the Trans, who are cast as quiet adopters of American culture, Fuchs loudly and insistently demands his place within the nation. While those in Evansville were curious about the stories behind these children, this curiosity was typically framed as a defense of American culture. In one opinion column, for example, Reverend Joseph Ziliak, a pastor in the neighboring town of Newburgh, ruminates on the loss and growth of young people's lives following a tragic highway accident resulting in the deaths of 27 young people. Contrasting this catastrophic loss with the success of a young Vietnamese woman, An Tran, who published one of the first studies on how long men and women spend in bathrooms as a way of informing architectural design, Ziliak begins to turn to questions about Tran's origins. What I do not know about the report, he begins, is the personal history of this young woman, An Tran. It would seem she is a Vietnamese bicultural background. Did she come here after harrowing difficulties in escaping from her homeland? Is she alone, or did her family also make it here? Someday I may find out. As with the previous reports, Ziliak finishes by questioning how Tran's life might have differed had she failed to learn English and integrate into American culture, using this as a benchmark of success and solidifying the fact that Tran represents the good immigrant. Ziliak's opinion piece appears in 1988, over a decade after the report about the trans siblings who, at the time, were in their teens. An, who bears the same name as the woman in Ziliak's op-ed piece, was 13, and it's reasonable to assume that she could be the same Tran, although given the commonness of both her given name and surname, without further evidence, this cannot be guaranteed. Indeed, no mention of the young woman's hometown is included, with the focus instead on her university affiliation. Ziliak's questions, which attempt to reach back into the past and construct a narrative about An, raise questions about how to track and trace down the personal history, as he calls it, of those whose lives are presented only in scraps or fragments. A question that is central to any venture into the children's archive. In attempting to pursue more lines of connection to Phuc, for example, it became necessary to turn away from historical records to community knowledge in the town of Evansville. This approach, which involves a slow process of carefully developing connections within the community that can help illuminate the historical records linked to the children's archive, provides oral and written accounts that complement the fragmented narratives of the young lives within the archive. In the case of Phuc, it provides a beginning point to see where he and his family ended up and the extent to which their lives became embedded in the Evansville community, with the ideal end result being to connect with Phuc himself to allow him to provide his own interpretation of the records relating to the letter from his former elementary school, the ones which ended up in the archives of Ezra Jack Keats. To follow up on these archival traces, I began making community links in Evansville, beginning with the Vanderburgh County Historical Society. My inquiry was met with a swift reply from Terry Hughes, the president of the society and a former educator in the Evansville School District. The answer was short and professional, promising to pass on my inquiry to the board of directors at the VCHS, but a second, much more personal reply quickly followed. With Hughes's permission, I share an excerpt from this email. I had two of the students in a different school across from Tompkins, An and Ben Tran. Neither spoke English when they came, but both had an incredible work ethic. Ben especially was able to transfer his knowledge of the universal language of mathematics into great success. After they left Howard Rusa Elementary School, I lost track of them, but no doubt they continued on their trajectory of success. While Hughes was not familiar with Phuc, his knowledge about the Trans, who also became examples of success stories in Evansville, provided guidance for tracing the lives of recently immigrated children to Evansville. The Trans, much the same as Phuc, have inconsistencies in their reported stories that could make it difficult to verify that each new document was indeed about the same child. In the case of the Trans, an incorrectly mentioned school name made it at first appear as if there were another set of Trans siblings. Yet in working with Hughes, I was able to confirm the relationship between the sparse documents I had so far, reaffirming the value of being able to draw on community knowledge to piece together such narratives. That said, this was only the beginning of the network of relationships needed in a participatory approach to the archive. While helpful in providing the contextual information I was seeking about the experience of Vietnamese immigrants in Evansville, providing a glimpse at least into how white residents of the town perceived them in an educational setting, I had yet to turn up any new information about Phuc. His voice, at least, remained hidden for the time being. Aware that the Evansville Library collected local memorabilia, including yearbooks from all of the major high schools, I contacted the reference librarian asking if any of these records might contain further proof of Fuchs' life in Evansville. Through this search, I learned about the high school Fuchs would have likely attended based on where he went to elementary school, but despite searching the stacks, the librarian helping me could find no record of Fuchs in the yearbooks dating back to the time when he would have been in high school. Unlike the trans siblings who can be found in these yearbooks, Fuchs and his family did not seem to settle in Evansville. Indeed, a further record documenting residential addresses shows that the Phams only resided at their home at 905 Stonebridge Road for a brief period. Unable to ultimately trace and contact Fuchs as I had hoped to do when I first set out on my research journey, though lessons from other similar efforts have taught me that this can be a long process which still has the potential to yield results, I was left with a closed story similar to Slobokina's public narrative of her escape from Russia. With only the most rudimentary details, I could only say that Fuchs and his family fled Vietnam in the first wave of refugees following the fall of Saigon in 1975, that they had likely transited through one of the major refugee camps in the United States before receiving sponsorship by a member of the Evansville community, and that following their arrival, their son Fuchs became one of the many examples the town flourished about the successful integration of these newly immigrated refugees. As disappointing as such an ending might be, it is useful to examine how, once Fuchs' narrative is disentangled from the literary archive, his story shifts and takes on new meaning. As part of the Ezra Jack Keats collection, housed at the Grummond Children's Literature Collection at the University of Southern Mississippi, the record mentioning Fuchs, a large oversized sheaf of paper written by a school teacher on behalf of her class, is a small file that appears alongside a set of school correspondence to Keats. Some of these archival materials, like the letter featuring Fuchs, are written from the group's perspective, while others are individually drafted, though still written in a classroom setting. Typical of fan mail, these letters are filled with admiration for Keats and his books, including the illustrations and the craft that went into making them. Children cite favorite books and gush over the collage technique employed by Keats, even recreating the same technique in their own artwork before sending it to the author/illustrator. Framed alongside these letters, the traces of Fuchs' life become overshadowed by the educational responses to Keats's work, directing, as one might imagine they would, attention back to the author and his life's work. The arrangement and framing of children's materials is particularly imperative, for it raises questions about what a children's archive is and how we might approach it as researchers in the field of children's literature. Collections like the de Grummond emerged in the mid-20th century, largely in response to a desire to preserve and save the original materials of children's authors and illustrators for educational purposes. Lena de Grummond, the founder of this collection, used these materials to instruct her library science students. But today, with the expansion of the field and theoretical and methodological shifts, one of the most important being the turn to the interdisciplinary field of childhood studies, the materials gathered up about children's lives, often in the form of fan mail and letters, becomes just as valuable as the dummies, sketches, and editorial correspondence found in the stacks of the archive. Indeed, there are new collections emerging, such as the Italian collection, Exercise Book Archive, which are dedicated to exclusively collecting this material as a way of informing conversations about the lived experiences of children from the past. As these new collections emerge and put forth collecting missions that diverge from earlier intentions to showcase the creative process of children's authors and illustrators, a creative and flexible methodology for collecting, displaying, and working with these materials must emerge in turn. So what, to return to my opening statements, might a participatory approach offer in these instances? Participatory research in practice seeks to work with living communities, and though this is not possible to apply exactly as intended in the case of historical research, particularly depending on the time period in which one is working, The focus on relationship building with those with a stake in the record gives life back to these materials. This can be a frustratingly slow process, but in all fairness, so is participatory research. Often done over long and intense periods of time with a small group or a specific local community, participatory research reaches its limit when it comes to trying to track down large amounts of data. It is best suited in these cases to develop what historians call microhistories, or richly detailed histories about the creators of historical records that are instructive for key questions in the field. A microhistory such as Fuchs' story, if followed to the end, has the potential to reveal more about the experience of Vietnamese immigrants during the tumultuous first wave of refugees following the fall of Saigon in 1975. It provides real-life accounts that supplement fictional narratives by writers such as Thena Lai, who has written about her own childhood memories of this challenging period of transition through her award-winning children's book, Inside Out and Back Again. In the case of Slobokina's memories, her accounts of transnational flight as a child provide a very different lesson. Because the literary archive is built to reveal more about the author, and in this case, Slobokina is quite the character who was intensely devoted to retelling her life history as a way of preserving her memory, there is more available than the little scraps provided about Fuchs' life. Yet despite the voluminous amount of archival material in her collection, Slobokina's voice becomes entangled with her childhood fans, often in uniquely interesting ways, as in the case with Mary. Though writing as an adult, her reflections on her childhood and the way that these reflections emerge through these engagements with the real child, as she herself refers to her young fans, returns to questions about voice in historical research raised by scholars such as Nell Musgrove, Carla Pascoe-Leahy, and Christine Maruzzi. As Musgrove et al. Remark in their essay on conceptual and methodological challenges to recovering historical children's voices, a major challenge for historians seeking children's voices is to avoid categorical confusion and unproblematic binaries. The example provided by the authors is a difference between voice and agency, and in doing so, they draw attention to the interventions of other key scholars in the field, such as anthropologist Spiro Spirou, who has already spoken extensively about the dangers of recovering children's voices without a thorough consideration of the frameworks in which these voices appear. Archival research is always risky business, particularly in instances where the child's voice becomes so entangled with that of the adults that it is difficult to discern who is speaking. In cases where correspondence continues over a period of time, there are also instances where the child no longer recognizes themselves in their previous writings or artistic work. In seeking to navigate the risks associated with recovering historical children's voices, it is imperative to consider how interdisciplinary practices, such as the participatory archival approach I have modeled, can both reframe children's original materials and provide an avenue for more ethical engagements with these voices. This approach, when coupled with interpretation strategies found in history and literature, enables researchers to reposition the child's voice within the community where it originated, asking, as microhistorians do, larger questions that emerge from the network of relationships connected to these young lives. While I don't believe that a participatory approach is the only means of completing this type of archival research, I certainly think it is one method worth adding to our repertoire for reconstructing the lives of children from the past. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you so much for this thought-provoking and I think very intellectually stimulating presentation. And I'm sure that there will be lots of questions. Really, thank you so much. So let's start our Q&A session. Remember that you can use the chat function, and if you decide to write your question down in the chat, I can read it. If you do not have access to our chat, just raise your hand and make sure to unmute your microphone and just go ahead. So who's going to be the first one to ask Emily a question? You know, after such thought-provoking presentations, everyone always needs a moment or two to process everything, all of the information, because I think that it was a really rich presentation, and you mentioned so many different things. It was interdisciplinary, transcultural. You talked about archival work, history, participatory culture. I can think of so many different questions, and I think that I need to process them in order to formulate logical questions, because I have so many and they're overlapping in my head. Yeah, so let me take a look at the chat. So far, we have greetings from Taiwan, and we have greetings from Poland. So that's lovely. So our audience is international, trans-cultural, so that's really good. Okay, we have a volunteer, someone you know really well, Anastasia Olanovich from the University of Florida. Anastasia, please go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. It's so good to see you, Emily, and I really, really enjoyed your talk. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to how marginalia might play a role in a participatory approach to children's literature. To what extent do you address little scribblings that are made in the margins of children's books, or are you more concerned with actual texts that children produce, for example, like letters?
So mostly I focused on things children have created. The exception is I was at the International Youth Library this summer, and I found some interesting examples where there were books that were, I think these were ones that were dated from the 1930s. And children, like there were instructions in the book where they were encouraged to color in the illustrations. And so I started collecting. I've only got one at this point, to be honest, but I'm interested in finding more and looking at how the children actually took up that invitation and what that can say about how they were engaging with the text. So I think there's definitely scope to look at that type of way in which children are interacting, especially because I am interested too in these kind of ways in which children's books play a role in shaping how children were constructed as global citizens and how they in turn kind of responded to these different kinds of national imperatives and initiatives from adults.
Thank you, and greetings from Florida.
Yes, a place I know very well.
Yes, a wonderful place, Thank you for this fantastic question. Yeah. So do we have any other questions? Yes, we have a question in the meeting chat. So, and we already have 2 raised hands. Okay, so I'll read the question, which is in the meeting chat. Thank you so much, Emily. It was very interesting. I was wondering, what was the biggest difficulty you found while working your archival work? Also, how is it possible to put together these amazing evidence from the past with current children's concerns, such as having their voices heard? Thank you so much, Bess Liliana Santos from Portugal.
Yes. Okay. So there's a couple parts to those questions. So some of the challenges. So the initial challenge was finding where I would find the material produced by children, because it's not very well cataloged where it's easy to find. So you can find things like fan mail, but there are different kinds of materials. And sometimes, so I began with large collections, special collections like the Grummond collection of children's literature and the Curlin collection of children's literature, which I did research visits at both of those places. But then I was also interested in kind of tracing down, other materials that were relevant to the larger project that I was doing. And they were not always in collections like that. They might be found in, a little historical society, or there's one item that I became really interested in that was from that participatory archive that I mentioned, Exercise Book Archive, but it was originated from a little town in New Jersey. And so I ended up kind of tracing that down and developing those community links in that town and starting to try to dig out what more I could by making those connections in the same way that I modeled with the example of Fuchs. Let's see the second part. I'm trying to remember the second part of the question. Can you read the second part again? I've lost my train of thought there.
Sure. How is it possible to put together the amazing evidence from the past with current children's concerns, such as having their voices heard?
Okay, so that is a really good question too. So because I've tried to really kind of, in a way that's a little bit scary as a scholar, be very revealing of the kind of process involved, because it is, I'm very much exploring methodology and what works and what doesn't. And so one of the things that I've been doing is a pilot project that is a participatory research project with actual children. And it's one that very much is kind of putting your own authority, both as an adult and as the researcher, in the back seat. And that is difficult when you're used to, I have to have results, and I know I know the questions I want to answer and how I want to get there. And you might have, difficulties in finding the material in certain cases, but for the most part, you have a lot more control. And I think similarly, that kind of work with children is really informative in thinking about how I'm working with the materials from the past. And also kind of there again, you have to sometimes take a back seat, and you don't always get to tell those narratives that you want to tell. So thinking back to Steedman and her, imagining the life of the little watercress girl and wanting to find it, and that desire involved in that process of narration, or even with Ziliak and his op-ed piece about the Tran and what was on Tran's life like, I want to know. And I find myself even doing that sometimes, like, I'll find this person and this is what's going to happen. It's going to be amazing. And kind of having to let go of that, my own desire to construct these narratives of what I hope to find, and letting those who become involved in the process, exert their own rights, as I mentioned with participatory archival practice, their right to the record, and telling that story and deciding what not to tell as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for your awesome answers to these two questions, actually. And we have more questions. Macarena, please go ahead with the question.
Here I am. Well, thank you very much, Emily. Emily, that was quite inspiring, and I enjoyed a lot. I guess we all did, right? Just to be following following the way that you were following the stories, and it's wonderful that we can have like these talks in which you can spend the minutes to tell us and to show all the documents. So that was quite a joy to follow. My question was very much connected to what you were just answering about this desire. So your desire to find certain stories, and I wonder whether this can be a productive force in the participatory research. So the way that I want to frame the question, of what I would like to hear more about, is your concept of voice. So for me, it's not that clear yet how you are looking at what voice is, and whether there's something such as the truth voice, and how your research would be able to respond to the question of how to trust each other's voices. And then whether if we, in order to make that question, we should also be asking the question of how to trust adult voices. And then we have a lot of literature about that, about
yes.
Let's say post-representational approaches, and the question of voice in general in qualitative research has been there all the time, right? So and what is about giving voice, and who is the one that is allowed to give voice, and then when a voice is real, because you as a researcher would say, well, this is the real voice and this is not the real, and here is there and that. But then I was wondering, so for this question about voice, so my question would be about your concept of voice and your concept of agency, but also I wanted to leave this sort of follow up from what you were commenting, and as a comment of whether this researcher's desire might be a productive thing here, rather than something to be cautious about. Well, probably it's part of the same, but if there's a way to integrate here the researcher's desire for certain stories and not for other ones, if you follow what I'm saying.
Well, I think in some cases it is productive, because it compels you to keep digging, right, for those stories that are hard to find. And one of the reasons that I became interested in looking at children's materials is because there were stories that I wanted to tell that were not necessarily the ones that were always being recorded. They weren't always found in the large collections either. And I wanted to be able to trace those stories. So in the bigger project with looking at children as global citizens, I didn't want to just write about white middle-class children and their thoughts about what it meant to be a global citizen. I wanted to look at Black children, and I wanted to look at immigrant children, and I wanted to look at children from different backgrounds. And so thinking about how could I find those stories that partly motivated the work that I've been doing. So in that case, I think it can be productive. When I think it becomes unproductive is when you're so committed to that narrative of what you want the story to say, that actually when you're engaging with those who have more of a right than you to tell that story, and you're not kind of negotiating that and allowing that narrative to change and emerge and develop in the way that it needs to, or letting go of things that you want to reveal, but again, are sensitive for various reasons, and keeping that private out of respect for those communities. And there are certainly communities that I've already encountered that, have a lot of historical divisions. And for that reason, it's very difficult to find archival material because those communities have kept that material close to them for very good reasons, right? So I guess those are the kind of the different sides of it that I'm thinking about. So that answers part of it, I hope. And there were different pieces to the question too, about asking about voice and authentic voice. And I know, like I mentioned that term, authentic voice. I wouldn't say that personally I think there's an authentic voice, right? And part of what I tried to show with examples like Slobokina is that those narratives that she's presenting, which probably doesn't sound too groundbreaking, really. I mean, these are things that a lot of us as scholars are well aware of. But it just, I think it's interesting to me because when I look at the published scholarship, both in the humanities and the social sciences, I was interested in the way that this idea of trusting children's voices kept coming up, and like, how do I trust this voice? How do I know that it's really the child's, narrative or their perspective? And just, it really brought home to me the fact that there's always this kind of mistrust of these narratives, and kind of breaking down that the fact that the adult's narrative is more trustworthy than the child's narrative. So I think these are things that I'm continually working through, and I think there are questions that continually come up in the field, but it's something that I think is really important to keep coming back to, as you say, like, what do we mean by voice? But when I'm thinking about, in particular, and working in the archive, what became very clear to me is that as much as I wanted to find things that were definitely produced by children, it was hard to completely disentangle them from the adults who were working with them. And there was always this element of mediation. There, like the examples that I gave, where it was the teacher writing it, the children, orally drafting it. And, there's other things within those educational contexts which are shaping what they may or may not say, right? Because they have this sense of, this is what the teacher wants, or there's lots of examples in the archive of copied and scripted material as well.
Thank you.
Attending to those frameworks, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, it does, for sure. Yeah, we have another question. Shuyasu, please go ahead.
Hi, I'm moving away from the technical stuff on the archival research. I'm more interested in how to deal with all the legal issues, like if it's open access, or is it, for example, you drag resources from many different archives, right?
Yes.
I mean, the exercise book archive is in Italy, but not in the US. I guess the guidelines are quite different. So how do you manage to get all the licensing from the vendor or from the government?
So Exercise Book Archive is a digitized archival collection, though it is it is based in Italy. And that's an interesting question about rights. I don't know if I'm answering the exact question that you're asking. So if I'm not, correct me in the middle of what I'm saying. But one of the things that I found really interesting in doing this work is that, especially the children's materials. So when they go into the archive, for example, especially those bigger collections, it's usually an adult author or illustrator who's donated this material. The children have no idea that their material's in the archive. And because it's the donor that gives the rights and permissions, you get to use that material and publish on it without them having any say whatsoever. And maybe they don't want that perhaps being made public. The one exception that I found to this was one of the last slides I presented, which is in 7 Stories, actually, the National Center for Children's Books, which is in Newcastle. It's a great collection. I recommend visiting if you can. And so in the Beverly Nadeau collection, she actually does go back and ask this child who'd written her a letter if she can have permission to cite her. And then the child, it's like 3 years later, writes back and says, yes, you may. That's fine with me. But that is the exception rather than the norm, right? So it's something that is also part of why I was interested in thinking about what could a participatory approach do in terms of thinking about the ethics involved of using this material, right? And some thinking back to what Macarena was asking about agency versus voice, giving agency back to, again, those with a stake in the record. Does that partially answer what you were asking, or is that a version?
Okay. That's exactly what I want to ask, because it's 1975 is still like they still have the rights, right? But for example, if I want to research like children who is like born in 2000, I think that could be a problem that you must to get the permission from them.
Yes. So it's interesting the way archival permissions works. And it's something that, you want to find and track down individuals or descendants of individuals, but it's not always possible. Like I tried with one over and over again, and I made contact with someone who was good friends with the son of the author of the original material, and I just never heard back, but they had auctioned off the material, so maybe they were ready to let it go. I don't know.
Thank you.
Thank you for this question. Thank you for your answer to this question. I think that it was a really interesting one, because there's always this question of ethics when it comes to archival work, especially when we're dealing with, archives from the, let's say, 60s, 70s, 80s. Very often these people are still alive, or their children are alive. So the question of ethics, agency, these are always entangled. So, okay, I think that we have another question by Macarena. Is that right, Macarena? Or maybe you have not lowered your hand, but if you have another question, please go ahead. And Justina.
No, sorry, I didn't lower my hand. I would do now, but thank you.
Okay. I thought that you had another question. You never know. Some people like asking questions. Justina, please go ahead.
I'm not sure if it's a follow-up question, but I'm wondering how you work with non-linguistic material. Could you maybe speak a little bit more about this? I don't know, drawings or whatever else is there? Images, more general sense.
So to be fair, I've collected a good amount of that material, but I have like all these images, thousands of images, and I've kind of, selected a few that I want to follow. So I think currently I've mainly worked with text-based material. But that said, I do think that there would be, a lot of times those materials do have the names of the children written on the back, for instance. And so I think I was saying earlier before the official talk started that sometimes I feel like, am I being a scholar still? Because I'm doing what almost feels like genealogical research and trying to find out the origins of these children and where they came from and their backgrounds. And, sometimes that can be very revealing. So in one case, for instance, I found out that, it was they called it a yearbook, but it was actually it was illustration. So actually, that is one case where I was interested in illustration, and he was called the art director for the class yearbook. But basically, it was just a kind of year in review where the children would write about the activities that they'd done, and in this case, this child did all the illustrations. But in learning more about his life, I found out actually he came from this working class background, and I think it was by the 8th grade was working in a factory, right? So, thinking about the fact that I wouldn't have known that about him or about his background and thought, oh, maybe this is a middle class child, but he wasn't, right? And so it gave me this kind of different kind of insight into, this child's own position and the fact that this was a voice that might not have been captured typically, right, within the archive, but because a lot of the materials I'm looking at are educational materials, it does kind of pick up some of those voices that might get lost otherwise, because they were at least briefly all in school together. And again, there's always not every child, but some of the voices that I wanted to kind of pick up and get their perspectives. And for me, it was particularly nice because it, again, like I said, the bigger project is about children, thinking about global citizenship and children constructed as global citizens. And those are the kinds of children we don't always hear about in the current published material about, again, it tends to focus on the middle class child, but again, seeing that there were other children who were seeing themselves as global citizens and kind of engaging in these activities.
I'm asking because I guess if you work with children here and now, let's say, it's always tricky to pay attention to, laughter, movement,
yes,
emotions,
such a great
engagements with objects, with the space around. So that's why I've asked about this non-linguistic context as well, and what would be a non-linguistic context in your research then? Yeah. I guess, and images came to my mind, but it might be something else, of course, as well. And also your comments, I think, is kind of takes us really to the roots of archives, because the question is, what is really archivable in the first place? That's right. Mm-hmm. Someone made these choices. This is also what you were telling us about a lot. It's all. I think it's. I don't know if you've read. I haven't, but I read about it a little bit. Derrida's archive fever. It's quite interesting, I think, in terms of talking about the power network, let's say, around the archive. Yeah, such absolutely. Maybe something to explore a little bit as well. But I don't know whether this is relevant.
Well, I think that's the thing too. It's not necessarily collected until someone decides it's valuable, right? So I mean, there was that earlier moment that I mentioned where it was, the materials of authors and illustrators and their kind of, the production side of, constructing children's books. But, if there's an increased interest in thinking about the child and childhood, then once scholars say this is valuable or others say this is valuable, then it starts to be collected, and collected, it's easier to find.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have one more question in the meeting chat, so let me read it. May I know how the approach and conceptual framework of microhistory help you with your current archival research? For instance, how does it help you better figure out the voices from the child authors? Would you mind explaining this approach with a bit more detail? Thank you so much. Sending all best wishes and greetings from Taiwan, Kate.
Oh, hi, Kate. Yes, I know Kate well. So microhistory is actually a term that I happened upon at another talk that I was sitting in, actually not very long ago, but it really struck me because it resonated me in a way, because that presenter was talking about the difference between a microhistory versus a case study. And I felt like, because the type of work that I'm doing is very much historically based, even though I'm still a literary scholar, that it seemed more accurate about what I was actually going about and doing, really kind of doing that kind of in-depth look at a very small historical record and trying to pull out as much as I could, but trying to find those stories which I thought had a greater meaning and could, raise these kind of larger either methodological questions or theoretical questions, or thinking about childhood and in the larger book project, thinking about global citizenship and topics like these. So it's something that I'm still exploring more, but it felt right for a way of describing what I was doing. And that is that's what I was trying to kind of, partly that probably made things a little bit messy in some ways, but trying to show that exploratory aspect of the work. And that, every time I find a new item created by a child, or these what I'm calling the children's archive, these materials of the children's archive, I'm thinking about what are the right methods. And, I think that there's a lot to be said for what participatory approach offers in terms of thinking about how your relationship to those items, but then also drawing on other areas like, history, and thinking about how you can kind of merge these different methods together and as a way of approaching the research.
Thank you. I think that it's a really interesting concept, and I think that the fact that you're using a variety of different concepts is actually a great, I think, advantage of your work, because it's just everything is so entangled, and it's always a really good thing, at least for me as a scholar. And what you've said about being a little historian working on the biography of a particular child, we always do that as literary scholars. We always research the authors whose books we're analyzing. So what is the difference, when it comes to studying the life of a child who's the author of something, of a text, and studying, the biography of Proust or Joyce? There's no difference, actually. It's all discursive, let's say. So, and the concept of microhistory, I think, is really useful. And yeah. So do we have any other questions? Because we have already asked Emily a few really thought-provoking ones. So I'm pretty sure, Emily, that now you have lots of fun ideas for your future work, because some of these questions have been just eye-opening. Yeah. So if we don't have, so if we don't have any other questions, but I'll ask again. If there are other questions, please use the chat or raise your hand. Like we have wishes, the meeting chat. People are thanking you. So if there are no more questions, okay, Justina, please go ahead.
I do apologize. I want to be a little bit provocative here. I had a lot of doubts about your comment concerning the search for, or this question, or your let's say, wish to determine whether a given material, let's say, a given text, whatever, was produced by a child or not. And I'm wondering if, for example, Spiro's thinking about children's voices and children's agencies as always relational, whether this is, and then you said that it's difficult to kind of disentangle, let's say, the adults' input, let's put it this way. So I'm wondering whether we should just maybe give up to some extent.
Yes, that was my point, actually. That
okay, all right.
You're not going to find like a pure, going back to what Macarena says, a pure, authentic piece of produced.
Yeah, but then what do you do? Then are you really researching children's voices? Are you recovering children's voices? Whose voices are you recovering then, or researching? That's, I think, question to address. Maybe
relationships, right?
Oh, yeah.
Relationships is that there are always these entangled things, and so it's being attentive to those entanglements, right? And that's part of what I'm trying to do. as I go about things, perhaps messily and not always.
Yeah, I'm asking because I'm facing these problems as well. So
yes.
How we handle this and methodologically, of course, ethically as well. I remember, if I may digress for a moment, but I also did a little bit of archive research with a collection of poems at the school. And there were many poems there. And I was trying to kind of think how, I was kind of trying to make an argument against a reviewer, in fact, because the reviewer of an article asked me to choose particular poems, and I kind of refused that because I thought that they create a kind of network. I was thinking in terms of these relationalities. It's one archive, the children kind of worked maybe not together, but at the same time on the same project and so on. So it's a little bit different, I guess, the nature of this archive is different maybe from, although maybe not really so much from what you are working on. And then someone asked me when I was talking about it somewhere, do we really need to, in the first place, recover these texts? Why are you doing this? Right? And you talked about this desire, but it's, I think, one thing, the desire maybe to become interested in something, to be kind of haunted by something. But then in the first place, why at all? Engage yourself with this archive. Why at all? I mean, it's there at the school and let it be there. That was the idea, I think, of the question.
Yes.
Right. And apparently the school didn't do anything with the archive, with the collection. Let it be like this. Right. So I think this is really the fundamental question. Why in the first place you are trying to change something, right? In this kind of state of affairs, let's say, right? As they are.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm just remembering my own dilemmas, I guess.
I partly included that bit about what counts as a children's archive because I've also had reader reports saying, but this isn't really children's material. This is adults speaking, and this is this and that. Yeah. And so, it, that's why I tried to kind of focus on that. But again, emphasize the kind of entanglements and mediation and that is also with the children's archive. And even when you look at the more traditional special collections of children's literature, they're always kind of defining meaning of what counts as archive. Are they libraries? Are they museums? I mean, there's always this kind of fuzziness about what it is. But for me, I don't want to be so narrowly focused on this is the child's material that I'm actually missing out on really important documents that illuminate children's experiences, especially children who are normally marginalized from different narratives in the historical record. Okay. Yeah, it makes sense. I think also in terms of, methodological approaches to participatory research, what kind of children do we work with? Do we get to work with, right? Yeah. Which children are really interested in working with us, right? And it's usually the children who, I guess, are able to, let's put it this way, right? And the others are kind of left out in a way. But the question is whether, they would like to. I mean, there are lots of ethical questions here about the participants. Okay, thank you. Just some random thoughts based on my experience.
Thank you. So now I have even more thoughts after Justina's question and your great answer. Yeah, so do we have any other questions? If not, I think we'll be done with our today's lecture. So thank you so much, Emily, for this fantastic talk. I'm pretty sure that everyone enjoyed it. I definitely have. I've learned a lot, for sure. And you have inspired me to work on something, which I've been thinking about working on for a while, but I will not share it with you now, maybe later. So thank you so much. And we're looking forward to having you here and Wrocław in person, of course. So remember that you're always welcome. It's not that far away from Newcastle. So yes, if you feel like coming to Wrocław and visiting our center, one of our centers, just let us know. We would love to have you here. So thank you so much. And I would like to thank the audience for asking these fantastic questions and for listening carefully to Emily's fantastic presentation.
And I would also like to add my thanks to everyone. I really do appreciate it. And I will continue to think about all the questions you've asked and to kind of push on those things where I still need to clarify and work more on. So it's really been helpful and thought-provoking for me as well.